Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining our JCU webinar series. My name is Professor Stephen Boyle, and I'm the Dean of the College of Business, Law and Governance here at JCU, and I will be moderating this webinar tonight. However, before we continue, I wish to acknowledge the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of this country, and pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders, past, present, and emerging, of the land on which we stand today. In the spirit of reconciliation, I also acknowledge the valuable contribution that Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples continue to make to James Cook University and the broader community. Now, this webinar is the latest in a series where we invite our top researchers and academics to share their expertise with the local community outside of the lecture theatre. In this webinar, you'll hear from JCU experts on what it takes to build a resilient economy and find out why transformative growth and fundamental reorientation of resources must be seen as integral parts of the solution. However, before I introduce our speakers, just some housekeeping. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box in your Zoom control panel, which you can see there. I will be monitoring this function throughout the presentation and will raise your questions with our presenters when appropriate. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers this evening. First of all, we have Dr. Taha Chaiechi, who is an Associate Professor of Economics in the College of Business, Law and Governance, and she is also the Australian Director of the Centre for International Trade and Business in Asia. Currently, Taha is serving JCU as an expert member on our academic board, and previously has contributed to the governance and the teaching and learning profile of the college in many different capacities. She's also Associate Editor-in-Chief for the Bulletin of Applied Economics. She's an expert in systematic modelling of dynamic relationships between economic, environmental, and social variables. Taha's research attitude is holistic, inspired by issues on different economic sectors such as health, tourism, environment, energy sector, and cities. At the core of her research philosophy, Taha is dedicated to the doctrine of sustainable development, and she uses the 2030 agenda as a malleable guide throughout her research. Our second presenter is Diana Castorina, who is a PhD candidate and also a sessional academic in the College of Business, Law and Governance. Her teaching experience in the higher education sector spans 10 years across both undergraduate and postgraduate offerings. Diana also draws on her experience within the private sector, where she worked as a research economist undertaking social and economic impact assessments. Her current research interests are in the areas of understanding individual decision-making, the sustainability of regions, and spatial econometrics. She's currently completing her PhD in economics in the area of inter-regional migration in Australia, where her overall research objectives seek to understand what makes people want to stay, move away, or move into a particular region. And finally, Dr. Josephine Pryce is an Associate Professor and our MBA course coordinator in the college. She has teaching and research interests in organisational behaviour with a focus on the sustainability of working lives. Her research explores voluntary work and the notion of occupation. In recent years, she's had the opportunity to avidly pursue her research interest in well-being, occupational communities, industrial and railway heritage, and green spaces. Jo's scholarship looks beyond the world of employment and the centrality of work to the economies. Rather, it seeks to challenge assumptions about work. It values the space beyond workplaces and asks people, especially business leaders, to address the 3 Ps: people, planet, and profit. Through her teaching and research, Jo endeavours to empower people through activation of self-awareness and development of the understanding of themselves and their worth as global citizens. Hence, she seeks to explore avenues whereby individuals can enhance their well-being and that of others as we work collaboratively towards a sustainable future. And I'm sure you'll agree, our 3 panelists will make for an interesting and very engaging presentation tonight. So I would like to invite Dr. Taha Chaiechi to commence the presentation.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that introduction, and good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for tuning in tonight. I'd like to start tonight's presentation with the notion of the wicked problem. that appears to be gaining some sort of wider currency and reputation in both research and practice. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this notion, a wicked problem, particularly in economics discipline, is a problem that is difficult or impossible to solve. And the reason for that is because there are usually a number of competing or conflicting requirements that they are playing in the background, and sometimes it's really difficult to recognize those problems and requirements. And probably the part that says is impossible to solve is a bit of an overstatement. Nevertheless, the notion seems to be applicable, or at least relevant, when dealing with the concept of sustainability, where there seems to be apparent tension between the goals and priorities that tie back into the three pillars of sustainability as we know them: people, profit, and planet. Each of these pillars or elements have their own set of priorities and requirements, and they seem quite reasonable and necessary when we look at those elements separately. However, when we look at them collectively, we may realize that the problem is a bit of complexion there. So let's have a look at those requirements and see what we're talking about. When we are talking about the people element of sustainability, we are referring to those social requirements, such as public health. So people need health, people need education, people need income, they need safety and security, they need housing, they need work-life balance, and all that. So those are the social requirements that we need to move towards in order to have a healthy society. When we are talking about the planet aspect, we are basically concerned with the environment. So issues such as sources of energy, energy consumption, natural disasters, greenhouse gas emissions, water quality, air quality, or even management issues such as recycling or waste management. When we are looking at the profit element of the sustainability, we are basically concerned with the economic performance from a business perspective. We are concerned with things like GDP. We are concerned with success or failures of our industries, such as tourism industry or manufacturing industries. We are concerned with transport systems. We are concerned with the global economy or technology and connectivity and so forth. So in practice, all of these requirements sound reasonable and often necessary, but it's only when we look at them together, a researcher or a practitioner may realize that some elements are in competition with one another. There are so many decisions that we make that may tick the economic part, and they create lots of economic incentives, but also they look after people. For example, we create jobs, so people have jobs, they have income, they can spend in the society, or we pay attention to the fairer income distribution in the society, but we may tend to ignore the environmental aspect of those decisions. Those decisions or initiatives are called equitable. There are times that we make economic decisions and we are kinder to environment. So like green technologies, or we are turning or switching to more renewable energies in our consumptions, in our technology and so forth. But we may not be necessarily paying attention to the society and to the social outcomes of those decisions. Those decisions are called viable. And there are times that the societies, whether they are local societies or global societies, they actually try to take the matters into their own hands, and they try to adjust their lifestyle so they are actually contributing to a more healthier environment. And that may result in a number of actions and decisions that we call them bearable. They may not necessarily incentivizing any economic aspects or activity, but they are certainly good for environment and for the people. But we only call those actions and goals sustainable if they are equitable, viable, and bearable at the same time. So with that little introduction about sustainability, what about resilience? the question that I want to ask you and also try to answer it here is that when we're talking about sustainability and resilience, are we actually talking about the same things? Are these two are the different sides of the same coin, so to speak? One thing that we have to remember is that the concept of sustainability from the time that has emerged in the literature has been very well established in research, at least, maybe not fully in practice, but in research. We have thousands and thousands of publications that focus on different areas of sustainability. So we have a good reference point to go to when we talk about that. When it comes to resilience, not so much. There is an overall lack of publications, scholarly publications around the concept of resilience. And the ones that they exist seem to be providing different number of definitions for resilience. And you may end up with 100 definitions. However, we still don't exactly know what to do with those definitions. So for me to answer this question a little bit better, whether these two concepts are two sides of the same coin, I would like to present definition of sustainability and resilience side by side so we can have a look at them. So as I just explained in the previous slide, sustainability in a nutshell means the ability to coexist in harmony between the stakeholders, in this case being people, planet, and profit. When it comes to resilience, looking through lots of literature and trying to kind of condense the definition, we see there are three main characteristics that they stick out when we are looking at the resilience. The first characteristic is the capacity to adapt to new conditions, and we call that adaptability. There is also a characteristic that shows a system actually is resistant against negative external shocks and is able to absorb some of those negative impacts, and we call that absorbability. And there is another characteristic that we are quite interested when we look at resilience and that's how quickly you can recover from an external shocks. So these three characteristics can sum up basically the definition of resilience for us. And next to sustainability, what we want to understand is what are the similarities now then between the two and what are the differences? The first similarity is that both concepts of resilience and sustainability try to describe a system. It could be almost any system, ranging from global economy to a single person's mental or physical health. So both of them are dealing with systems, which is very important because when they are focusing on systems, they are quite interested to see how the system functions under two scenarios, A, under normal conditions, and B, under shocks. So in an essence, both resilience and sustainability are concerned or interested in system survival or system survivability, which has a great implication. And the implication is that we see this joint focus has resulted in a lot of common methodologies in research. So for those of you who may be familiar, methodologies such as life cycle analysis, structural analysis, impact assessment analysis, impulse response analysis, and socioeconomic analysis, they all can be applied in both concepts. And so they share a very strong foundation when it comes to research methodology. The third similarity is that both of these concepts have been heavily linked to global political agendas, where global organizations such as United Nations or WHO or other climate change forums and conventions and nonprofit organizations are actually trying to promote these two concepts at the same time. A few examples can be United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. It can be also United Nations development programs that they offer across the globe. A lot of agreements have been signed around the issue of both sustainability and resilience. The latest agreements that you have probably heard a lot in the news has been Paris Agreement. And the reason for that is we just heard that a week ago, probably, that President Trump has withdrawn from that Paris Agreement, which is basically about meeting certain environmental and sustainability goal by mid-century point. So there are a lot of strong motivations and incentives out there to promote these two topics hand in hand. and together. And because there has been a recognition that these two topics have overlapping goals, that has resulted in combined department formation. Lots of government agencies and also nonprofit organizations started to forming departments that they are under the tag of sustainability and resilience at the same time. Interestingly enough, universities are also kind of trying to move towards that way. So when they're teaching sustainability, they also refer to resilience. So this has resulted in some kind of practical movement around these two topics looked at the same time. However, literature tends to also talk about the differences between the two. One of the differences that they're looking at is, or one of the differences that some literature is referring to is that sustainability is mainly about using traditional methods to allocate or reallocate your resources, whereas resilience is focusing on innovative use of resources. And I personally do not 100% agree with this statement, because we have seen, and every day in research that is coming out, we see that there are innovative methods of sustainability, and also there are resilience techniques that they're quite traditional. So what's something that some literature are talking about. The second argument that some literature are putting forward is that these two concepts are two separate concepts, because sustainability focuses on the outcome and resilience focuses on the process. And that might be true. However, it doesn't mean that these two are mutually exclusive. They can coexist at the same time. We can come up with frameworks and agendas that part of it focuses on the outcome and part of it focuses on the process. So I don't see them as mutually exclusive, but I see them more complementary. Now I want to zoom in a little bit more onto resilience, and I want to introduce to you the concept of economic resilience. In a nutshell, in economics, the definition of resilience is ability of a system to maintain functionality after being shocked. So that's in a nutshell. But when it comes to economics, economists are interested in two different types of resilience. One is static or instantaneous economic resilience, and the other one is dynamic economic resilience. So let's see, what do we mean by static and dynamic? Static resilience is basically when you are interested in the ability of coping with a problem immediately after a shock is imposed. So in an essence, we are just interested in the response of a system in one point in time. So that's a static, which is also a topic of interest amongst engineers when they're dealing with resilience. But for economists, the element or dimension of time is also important, because we also want to see the movement and the way that the variables interact with one another over time. When it comes to static or instantaneous economic resilience, we have two types of resilience. One is called inherent and one is called adaptive. Now, what do we mean by those? Inherent is basically, okay, a shock is imposed. What do you do immediately after? I'll give you an example. For example, a factory is running, a production factory in a weekday. Everyone is at work, and in the middle of the day, we lose electricity. There's a power outage. What do? So more than likely, the very first thing that you do within the first or second minute, you just turn to backup generators. So backup generators are sitting there as a resilient technique, right? And you don't use them until the power is out, and then you immediately switch back to that. That is an inherent resilient ability. What about the adaptive? The adaptive is when we start acknowledging that when the shock hits, you may lose some of your resources. Then what do you do with the remaining resources in order to still stay functional? I go back to the same factory example. Again, same factory, same weekday, everybody is at work. This time, there is no power outage, but your air conditioning has stopped working. What do? If it's a good day, if it's not too hot, probably can open the windows, bring in the fans and cool down the temperature. And you probably can expect the workers to work for the remaining hours of the day or even come back to work tomorrow, but you cannot expect workers to continue working under that condition for 2 weeks or 2 months. So what you have to do, you have to quickly adapt to the new condition. This is a new reality and you have to do something about it. So you either get their conditioning repaired or you buy new system. So those are still a static level of resilience that we talk about. In dynamic resilience, we are quite interested in ability of a system to recover over time, the speed of recovery, and also efficient allocation of resources over time. So we have lots of resources available to us, including capital assets, financial assets, workers, land, office spaces, and also and human capitals and so forth. How do you actually manage to shuffle them around over time in order to improve your resilience? So these are by definition somewhat. It is also important to mention that resilience is operative at 3 different levels: micro, meso, and macro. The micro level of resilience is exactly what we just explained in the case of the factory losing power or a conditioning. So it applies to individual agents, whether they are businesses or households. As households, we are all resilient to a degree, especially for those of us who are living in Australia, and we know we are always exposed to, for example, natural disasters. Different part of Australia, different types of disasters, but we are always exposed to something. And throughout the year, you always hear that you have to be well prepared. We always have been told that you have to have enough supply and medication and basically clothing and everything to be able to survive 3 days, for example, if you are waiting a rescue. So those are the micro level resilience that we talk about. The meso level is actually concerned with the market level resilience. And we have a lot of mechanisms at market level to improve resilience of a market. And I'm not going to really talk a lot about the contingency planning or the allocation of resources, but I want to bring an example about the Pryce mechanism. I want to take you back to 2011 when we had that huge cyclone Yasi in North Queensland. And if you remember, cyclone Yasi hit and it just destroyed a lot of crops and a lot of farms and agricultural products. So all of a sudden there was a breakdown in the supply. We lost lots of supply. I want to bring you back to that banana scenario. So suddenly, and we lost a lot of bananas amongst other agricultural products, but there were amount of bananas still available. So what happened, those farmers brought their bananas to the market and they pushed the prices high to make sure the buyers who still want to buy banana, really want to get banana, they still can purchase it, but they had to pay much higher premium prices. Now, what does it tell you? The prices in the time of crisis are like pain to the body. They hurt, but they are also signaling that there's something wrong. So you have to do something about it. So those kind of mechanisms in the market level also are helping us to achieving more resilience at a medium kind of level. But there are times that disasters can hit and the scale of disaster is so huge, such as pandemic that we have experienced and are still experiencing this year, that the resilience, the main decisions around resilience has to go all the way up to the government and central banks in Australia, Reserve Bank of Australia. And more than often, they result in changes of fiscal policy and monetary policies to help with the recovery of the economy. Now, for example, I'm sure you all recall that Reserve Bank of Australia has reduced interest rate multiple times in 2020 as a response to COVID-19. In terms of fiscal policy, the government has been injecting trillions of dollars to the economy. And by no means we are going to discuss the effectiveness of any of those policies tonight, because that will be the whole another presentation. But I also want to say that not only making decisions about fiscal and monetary policy is part of the macro level resilience, we also can plan for resilience and embed them into our systems automatically. And that is what we call in economics as automatic stabilizers. And for example, in Western societies, especially for example in Australia, those automatic stabilizers are referring to taxation system as well as welfare system. A good example is that when there is prosperity and everybody has job, they pay taxes. As you get promotion in your job, get more money, you pay more taxes. If you lose your job if you go back to the part-time job, you pay less taxes. If you lose your job, you pay no taxes and you receive payments. So these kind of automatic stabilizers are also able to absorb some of that external shock and help us to recover a bit quicker in the time of crisis. Now, what you see in this slide is my very premature attempt in drawing a concept that we call business cycle in economics. And what business cycle is basically showing you is the normal and natural fluctuations of economic activities over time. When you look at the real data, they don't look that smooth, they don't look that balanced. So you can just see spikes ups and down. But in an essence, your expectations from business activities over time is that business or economic activities grow over time. So there is a positive trend or expected positive trend around the concept of business cycle. But let's say this what you see in front of you is a business as usual scenario, and then something happens to the economy. It can be COVID-19, it can be bushfire, it can be storm or anything at such a large scale that suddenly businesses start closing down, or they just lose capital, so they can't perform anymore. And suddenly this is the path that we begin to see. So businesses, but the level of economic activities start to dive deep, and that's what puts us in the danger of going into recession, and it's going to take a very long time to recover, especially if we don't have any resilience planned in our systems. But let's assume that we do have some plans, maybe not very modern and well-taught plans, but we do have some resilience embedded in our system. Then the shock happens. What do you expect to see? That's probably what the orange line is trying to show. So what has happened, those resilient techniques that you have embedded in the system are able to absorb the severity of the original shock that we would have experienced without resilience in place. What if we are very, very well prepared, and when a shock hits, then what happens? Probably something like that green path or green line. So with a high resilience, you are able to absorb higher damage or avoid a lot of loss. And with a lower resilience, everybody experience almost bankruptcy, which is why resilience is so important. Now, for us to understand what is the difference, you can just look at the green area, the distance between the green and the red line, and that's how much you can avoid losses in terms of resilience. That's the difference between having a resilience and no resilience at all.
So, just jump in there. Sorry, Taha.
Sure.
So that's the concept of resilience, but how do you actually measure that economic resilience component? Is there a way?
That's a very good question. Thank you, Stephen. There are multiple ways that researchers are suggesting to use to measure resilience. But if I want to make that very, very simplified, for example, just on this diagram in front of you, so the total damage as a result of disaster can be from somewhere from here, I'm pointing on this screen, I hope you can see it, to the lowest minimum point in the red diagram. That is a potential full scale of full damage without resilience. And when we have a resilience, and let's say high level of resilience, this is the avoided loss. So if we divide, so first of all, we have to estimate how much we're talking about in dollar values. But if we divide the avoided loss by the potential full loss, that's the easiest way to actually measure resilience. But there are multiple other ways that you can measure resilience. But in a nutshell, you need a toolbox of indicators to basically capture exact values of those resilient techniques and the impacts that they make. So as we were researching into the area, we started thinking that there are no wicked problems because there are solutions. And we started recognizing that resilience plays a key role in developing those solutions. What we have to do basically is put aside this discourse of similarity and differences and treating things as separate concept and start thinking of resilience and sustainability as intertwined, like a DNA, where two strands are represented by resilience and sustainability, and they are interlocked by the three elements of people and planet. And that requires us to take a step back, reframe, recalibrate our deepest held assumptions in order to achieve a resilient economy. I'm going to stop almost here, but before I hand over to my colleague Diana Castorina, I just want to say that building on these kind of research interests, last year expression of interest were sought from researchers from JCU Australia and JCU Singapore, and we asked for interested researchers to join a big project around community transformative economies and resilient economies. And this project became a flagship project, which is under the Center for International Trade and Business in Asia in the College of Business, Law and Governance. And a year later, we have almost 11 projects as nested projects under this flagship, and a lot of fantastic research is being undertaken by our researchers. Tonight, we want to share with you updates from 2 of these projects that I have highlighted here in yellow. So building stronger regions through people is what Diana is going to be talking about. And then later, my colleague Josephine will talk about reorientation of land for public parks.
So I'm just going to jump in there, Taha, again. So before we move on to those 2 projects, is there a way we can find out more about the others and the overall whole flagship program?
Absolutely, absolutely. So what we will do when we post the slides onto the platform and provide these supporting documents, we will definitely make sure we provide a link to the center website, which is the only research center within the College of Business, Law and Governance. And then we also provide you the link to the flagship page so you can go and see all the good work that is happening. Lots of publications is coming out, even though it's only been 12 months since we started working on this project. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks for your patience. And now I hand over to my colleague, Diana Castorina.
Thank you, Taha. Thank you for that introduction and welcoming our audience tonight. So as Taha mentioned, this project as part of my research for my PhD is people building stronger regions. So just to start off with, I just want to bring your attention, if we could just change the slide, Taha.
I'm trying, yes, I'm sorry, just kind of stuck, but it should come up now. Yeah.
Do you see great. It? Yes, lovely, thank
Beautiful.
You.
You're right.
So we can see on the screen 2 images, really quite contrasting communities. On the left, we've got one which is densely populated, quite built, and on the right, one which is vast. Each of these communities and these regions have attributes which characterize them. Some of the attributes will be appealing to some people, and for other people, not so much. There are forces which pull people towards regions, and there's forces which pull them out or push them. What we know in the research is that these push and pull factors, the forces behind them don't exert equally, and nor are they perceived to be the same amongst different people within our communities. But what remains necessary for both of these regions to survive are people themselves. And so we need to get varied people who bring different skill sets which serve and enable the functionality of that region. So we heard Taha talking about that economic resilience, maintaining the functionality after being shocked. Well, we need to get that region being able to function in the first place. And so we need to bring people into those communities. The strength of that region, its viability, and indeed the resilience is going to depend on the human capital that resides within that region. Next slide, please. Yet for some of our regions within Australia, population is declining, and attracting people into these communities continues to be a priority for policymakers. They need solutions on how to access the necessary skills and labour to keep those communities sustainable. But the challenge doesn't just stop there. It's one thing to try and get solutions to attract people into these communities, but we also need to look at how do we retain them. Particularly in our country towns, there's a persistent concern on how do we retain people. For the past 4 decades, this has been a challenge. So how do we get people to make the move? Taha, could we change the slide? The survival of local industries depends on it, as does the justification to have the social infrastructure which actually serves those people. So we need the schools, we need the hospitals and so on. And on the other side, we also need to consider those locations which are quite densely populated. You know, we've got some coastal communities in particular where they can't even secure insurance for their homes. Right? So it's simply, you know, there's just not enough diversification occurring to make it viable for those insurance companies. And interestingly, with COVID, that external shock, we've actually witnessed how that shock due to the health pandemic has created a more favourable environment to bring people into these regions which are more dispersed. That's both from the viewpoint of the demand on the services, but also in terms of the contagious nature of the pandemic itself. So it's with these needs in mind that this particular study looks into the motivations of why people are moving interregionally within Australia. If we want to induce people to move, the first question is we need to know who's making that call. The past research has been based on the individual. There's been data constraints around that, but typically it's been focused on the breadwinner, which happens to be, in that time, the male. Societal norms have changed quite considerably to those, you know, households of the 1950s and 60s and 70s. We've got multiple breadwinners in a family. So there's the decision-making unit is actually going to be influenced by multiple people. And so we've got to look at ways and how do we actually measure that collectiveness across all those people. For this research, we're utilising ABS census data, but at a micro level. When it's given to us, it's actually presented at an individual level. So part of the task was to actually conform and try to customise it so that it was representative of that collective decision-making unit. So bringing it into something which represented more of a household level. The challenge was to actually get measures which then represented those households. And our study is indicating that these collective measures are important. So it's actually reaffirming that it's not the individual. We need to be looking at that whole household. Some of those measures that we have found to matter include the household size. We also look at the income in that family. Age is one of those variables which is really quite closely linked to their life course, right? So the life cycles. So we wanted to still incorporate that. And so what we did, we looked at the age of the eldest person in that household. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the male. We've got many different types of households. Some of them include elderly parents that live with really busy households. We've got females that may be the oldest in that family, and so on. So we still wanted to bring age, and this is coming up important as well. In terms of trying to measure the skill sets of that human capital based on their qualifications, we're looking at the skill set not just with one individual, but across that whole household. So is it, are we finding that it's actually quite dispersed, or is it isolated, so much more concentrated? Again, this variable is coming up, important. A novel measure that we've included was one which was trying to represent the social link. Religion has shown in research that people who consider themselves to be religious are also quite embedded into that community. So they're involved in things such as volunteering. They're quite connected and engaged. what we did was use a measure which looked at, did that whole household consider themselves to be religiously affiliated? It didn't matter which religion, or some of them, or none of them. And again, we're finding that those social ties do matter, and at that household level. Next slide. Thank you, Taha. The next part, which is really important, we've established who's making that call, but we also need to look at migrants. The term that we used is quite broad. And what we know, there's a temporal dimension to it, there's a spatial dimension to it, and there's a social dimension to it. So we looked at the social dimension. Distance is really important. We can say that you're a migrant simply by, you've moved. So you're looking at that sort of mobility. But what we know that those people who only move short distances versus those that move quite considerable distances, they are going to face different consequences. The displacement impacts vary, and they're quite different between the two. So there's an importance there to try and distinguish them. But as you can see, just in that left corner, that model, we've got some nodes there. People can actually still reside in one area and commute quite a fair bit of distance. What that allows for that household to do, or that family, is that they might be commuting quite long distances, but they're still accessing, the schools, they're still accessing perhaps those groceries when they come back home, and so on. So there's only partial types of displacements occurring. What we want to do is get that separation. So at what point does it actually become that long distance migration, not one which is just representing a residential mobility, moving from the next neighbourhood, because you don't lose those ties, you can still maintain them. So we want to be able to get a full displacement that's being represented here. So we want to know the migration motivations of those long distance migrants. Thank you, Taha. So what we're interested in is looking at that table. We're looking at that bottom right side that's highlighted in the grey. Okay, so the temporal component, we want to be measuring people who've actually permanently moved, okay, not just sort of a temporary movement. For this particular study, because we are using the ABS actually has their own measurement. And so we are bound by that, but we are using quite a period of time, 5 years, between where they originated and then where they've indicated that they've actually moved. So we can actually measure there's an actual change in that region.
Diana, I'm going to jump in and just ask a quick question.
Yes, Stephen.
Yeah, short distance, long distance. What is the sort of indication? What's the threshold point where we jump from being a short distance into a long distance migrant?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Stephen. So with this research, we do look into that. We are trying to establish that threshold point, and we do some econometric modelling to determine that. But we're finding that tolerance of long distance commuting is up to about 150 kilometres in Australia. So I want to stress there that is actually Australians. Okay, 150 kilometres sort of commuting in somewhere like in Europe would be very different. So you wouldn't sort of apply it there. But in Australia, in this sort of data set that we're utilising and with the modelling, we're finding variations that are occurring at about the 150 mark. So that's sort of our preliminary results at this stage. But that's a good question. So as I mentioned, utilising the census data, it has identified a region. And so based on that, we can actually start to use some GIS. We look at some other sort of modelling to measure that sort of importance that regions place. Which brings us to the next part, and it's really the way I started, which was looking at those push and pull factors. There's a model on the right-hand side, which is depicting, your pluses, your minuses, and then zeros, which are cancelling out. As I said earlier on, when we perceive, a region, something might be attractive, something which is attractive to us may not be so much for somebody else. So using where they originated and then where they moved, and only for long distance migrants, we are looking at that influence. So which is going to have more of a, influence? Is it going to be the push or is it going to be the pull? So we look at that net effect. And as we can see, that's coming up in this preliminary study, we're finding that to move long distance, they're moving obviously to where jobs are. Okay, so jobs are important. They're moving into those denser areas. So if they're going to move long distance, they want to make sure that there's a job that they can go to. We used measures to not only look at economic factors, but we also wanted to look at those environmental factors. So we utilized another database which overlaid with GIS to try and measure conservation space. So how much space was actually being dedicated to conservation. In that one there, it was showing neutral for the long distance migrants. The final one, which was going back to those social ties, we wanted to look at the percentage of the residents that were indicating to have a religious affiliation and see whether or not that played an importance. Now, what was interesting in this one, that this one here was the bigger the difference in terms of being a lower religion. But when we went back to the modeling, which was looking at to move or not to move, those people that indicated that they were of a religion were the stayers. So as I said, it's one thing to attract, but then what's the retention? So it highlights the importance there of those social and cultural capitals. Okay, so it's showing that those religious people aren't moving. So to recap on the final slide, if we want our communities to be able to function, we need those people. Now, looking at economic resilience, whether or not you can actually bounce back after a shock, the first step is to actually be able to function. So we've got to get those people in there. We have to look at, it's not just the individual. How do we actually consider the whole family, the whole household? We need to be able to distinguish between only being a short distance migrant and a long distance migrant, because there are different displacement impacts. So making sure that, it's not just a residential movement. And while we focus on this pull, being able to attract them, we've got to consider that push, because it's that push. If we can highlight what those push factors are, then we can work to use those to be able to retain them. Now, how do we diffuse them so that we actually are retaining them? So this is really coming back again into that livability. And this is where Jo Pryce comes in, and she actually talks about some of these livability factors, looking at the land for public parks through her research.
Thanks, Diana, and hello, everyone. As we continue to talk about what it takes to build a resilient economy, I want to focus on the aspect of fundamental reorientation of resources as an integral aspect of solutions for a brighter and fairer future for all. As part of those solutions, I propose that the reorientation of land for public parks can be a way to provide socio-cultural and economic benefits. My focus today is on urban public parks, and in particular on New York Central Park and the Cairns Botanic Gardens. Cities and urban areas more broadly provide spaces that define and transform who we are, what we do, and how we live. Such urban spaces include public parks, which are green spaces that provide habitats for flora, fauna, and people, and also serve as recreational, commercial, and educational places. The literature shows that public urban green spaces, such as parks and botanic gardens, are of importance to people's well-being and to quality of life. It highlights how public green spaces contribute to the physiological and psychological health of individuals. As we can see here, the advantages include a number of factors, such as reduction of stress, absorption of ambient air pollution, reduction of socio-demographic gradients by providing equal access for residents, and so on. While studies to date bring insights into the value of public green spaces and research interest in exploring the importance of such spaces to human health is growing, a better understanding is required of the characteristics of green spaces and of the benefits they promote. We're currently working on a project that explores the sustainability and resilience, no surprise, of public urban green spaces and their impacts on the well-being and resilience of individuals and communities. As part of that project, we're looking at New York Central Park. I specifically am looking at that one, and Ken's Botanic Gardens precinct. But before I talk of these two parks, a word on park sustainability. Parks are also important for strengthening of communities, and they make cities and neighbourhoods more attractive places to live and to work in. In terms of the sustainability of parks, the higher the usage of the park, the more indicative it is of the attributes of the park to meet the needs of the various stakeholders. The attributes may include aspects such as access to the park, assets and amenities in the park, safety, satisfaction, and eco-friendly features. The eco-friendly innovations can include things such as renewable energy, green buildings, and facilitation for green jobs. Now moving on to Central Park. Central Park is recognised as a world-class destination, but its history shows its repurposing from a rocky and swampy landscape since its construction began in 1858, well over 162 years ago, and its survival following several periods of decline, neglect, and mismanagement. Against these shocks, the fight to preserve Central Park and uphold its original purpose as a retreat for urban life has ensured that Central Park has sustained its place in the New York landscape. Following the most recent period of deterioration, which began in the 1960s, the citizens of New York came together to form the Central Park Conservancy. In partnership with the city, the Conservancy has been able to rebuild and restore the park. In the first instance, I sought to look at Central Park through the three lenses of people, planet, and profit. Amongst the various studies conducted on the socio-economic value of Central Park, a report conducted by a company called Appleseed was released in 2015. It highlighted important contributions of the park to New York and listed these in 7 categories, which we see here. A cluster of enterprises, a resource for community residents, adding value to cities to property near the park, and sharing of intellectual property amongst them. The report showed that in 2014, the Central Park Conservancy directly employed 453 people. It had a payroll of nearly 21.4 million and spent approximately 15 million on purchases of goods and services, including construction from the New York businesses. Other enterprises also benefited. Places like restaurants, the Central Park Zoo, carriage drivers, vendors and others, they all directly and indirectly accounted for 1,345 full-time equivalent jobs, with nearly 67.5 million in earnings and 153.7 million in citywide economic output. Quite a significant impact. Now, looking at planet and people, a report from Columbia University highlights the biodiversity of Central Park and details the 3 main ecosystems in the park: the urban forests, the urban aquatic systems and the urban lawns. While the aim of the report was to examine how climate change may affect the natural landscape of the park, it highlighted the importance of Central Park to the well-being of individuals and how designing a vibrant public urban green space can contribute to a healthy and livable place. The findings from the literature is further supported by my own observations. I was fortunate last year in 2019 to spend over a week visiting New York Central Park. I would go there every day, and what struck me about Central Park was the myriad of uses that it served. Every day when I returned to the park, I would discover yet another way in which it was being used. And here are some photos from that trip. Aside of the flora, fauna, and fascinating geological landscapes, which were a real surprise to me, it provides an oasis for visitors and residents. 843 acres all up, a landscape repurposed over the years to accommodate a range of spaces, formal and informal spaces, recreational activities, and biologically diverse ecosystems. So we see with Central Park that there is a blend of features and attributes that can align with sustainability, and the fact that it has survived and blossomed for over 160 years in a megacity is testimony to its resilience. The case of Central Park shows that parks and cities must become more resilient to the physical, social, and economic challenges that are a growing part of the 21st century. For Central Park in particular, places like that must endure the stresses that weaken the fabric of a city on a day-to-day basis, things like noise and light pollution and urban heat islands. So well done, New York Central Park. And now moving on to the Cairns Botanic Gardens precinct. So taking on board the example of New York Central Park and studies that highlight the value of public urban green spaces, we have begun an examination of the CBG precinct to evaluate how sustainability and resilience are featured in this precinct. Research into the precinct is limited. One study in 2016 considered the CBG precinct as a potential tourism attraction. The study highlighted the lack of data on visitors to the garden and subsequent absence of information on the socio-economic benefits of the precinct. Our study seeks to add to understanding of the value of the CBG precinct. Once again, adopting the lens of people, planet, and profit, we considered the recreational, commercial, and educational aspects of the precinct as we examined the sustainability of the precinct. This map shows the extent of the green spaces and highlights that the precinct is actually part of a mangrove ecosystem with extending low swamp areas that have been repurposed for recreational, commercial, and educational activities, but still preserve the environmental character of this fascinating landscape. It also shows how people have access through that landscape. On the right-hand side, where the bamboo collection is, there is a forest of different varieties of bamboo through which people can walk or ride their bike. On the left-hand side, there is the rainforest boardwalk that provides access through a range of vegetation ecosystems from the lowland swamp forest to the Melaleuca wetlands. And in the foreground is an area for a garden that showcases tropical food plants and an orchard with a range of tropical fruit plants, things like jackfruits, carambolas, Malabar chestnuts, jaboticaba, and mangosteens. I want to point out a few more features of the precinct that highlight the socio-cultural and economic relevance and importance of this area. Under the theme of discovering the CBG precinct, there is a range of areas that represent the various stakeholders. Notably, there is the Aboriginal Plant Use Garden, which showcases the plants used by the various groups of the rainforest Aboriginals who lived in the Cairns to Mareeba area. There's also the Gondwana Evolution Garden, which shows some of the relic plants of times gone by that we are fortunate to have in North Queensland. There's also the heritage water tanks, which are remnants from World War II and now serve as the Tanks Arts Centre. There's also Zhangjiang Friendship Garden, a recent addition to the precinct and acknowledging our sister city in China. Under the theme of walks and trails, there are some notable trails and tracks, and the Rainforest Boardwalk that I mentioned earlier. Under the theme of hospitality and celebrations, we see a couple of restaurants, the yearly carnival on Collins, and the regular markets and exhibitions. Under the theme of education and occupation, there is the Little Tackers program, green jobs and volunteers.
Just jump in there, Joe. I mean, that last previous slide talks about people, planet and profit. And I'm sure we can see very obviously the people part, the planet part, but do you have any sort of plans in relation to the Cairns Botanic Gardens to estimate the socio-economic contribution to the gardens in sort of monetary terms? Or is that too much?
Okay, thanks, Stephen. And I'm obviously not the economist in the team, but the short answer is yes. And the economist in the team will be using some techniques to measure the socio-economic contributions and conducting socio-economic modelling to determine the dollar signs. However, I want to point out that equally there is the social science approach that will provide rich data that can contribute to the socio-economic contributions. So for example, what we've done so far has been based on observations, photo elicitation and a desktop analysis. From here, the plan is to conduct things like surveys with visitors, residents and tourists, and to conduct interviews with various stakeholders, including members of the council and the Botanic Gardens. Our intent is obviously to adopt a multifaceted approach that will capture the socio-cultural, environmental and fiscal data. So I hope that answers that question. So bringing it all together, the precinct presents a range of socio-cultural and economic benefits to the residents of and visitors to Cairns that showcases its sustainability. In terms of resilience, it can be examined in two ways. The resilience of the precinct itself to shocks, things like natural disasters, and the functionality of the precinct in building the resilience of the various stakeholders. In its 134-year history, the precinct has endured natural shocks, including cyclones, which are a common phenomenon up here. And as recent as September 2019, only last year, it was reported in the Cairns Post that workers were removing trees and shrubs at the gardens after a patch of forest had failed to recover following Cyclone Yasi, which Taha mentioned earlier, which hit Cairns in 2011, so some 8 years earlier, and they finally decided to remove what obviously was not as resilient. So in this case, we see the natural environment has succumbed to shock, but fortunately intervention by humans can help conserve the functionality as well as the aesthetics of the natural environment so that the integrity and the appeal of the precinct can be maintained. It also shows that an appropriate management of these gardens is important for their sustainability and the resilience of these landscapes to natural shocks, which is something to consider and further document. The cases of so I want to finish on a statement that the cases of New York Central Park and the CBG precinct have highlighted two main points: that if public green spaces are appropriately maintained, their future can be sustained. But also, on a second point, that the resilience of public green spaces serves to sustain socio-cultural factors and promote economic growth. And now bringing all of our three presentations together, I want to say that in looking ahead to what our economic future may hold, we say that we need to look back. Historically, large-scale crises have led to new ways of thinking and revolutionised the way people live. Each crisis is not an exception. They will impact people, planet and profit to varying degrees. The impetus is on us as humans to take this time of crisis to reflect, review and redesign. For businesses, it is a time to consider diversification and continuity plans to minimize potential damage. For businesses, profit alone should not be the goal any longer. Businesses need to plan for sustainability, and part of that is giving consideration to the triple bottom line of people and planet alongside profit. And as we have seen here today, resilience plays a key role in sustainability and the future viability of businesses. For individuals, it is a time to strengthen our resilience, and in crises to see opportunities for training and upskilling. Difficult times provide windows of opportunities to learn new skills or to upgrade existing skill sets. This is particularly important because when the recovery phase starts, the economy will expand quickly, and we as part of the workforce need to be ready to move onwards and avail ourselves of these opportunities. On a further note, as citizens of communities, crisis calls upon us to protect and empower those most at risk. And as citizens of the planet, it is incumbent upon us during these times of crises more than ever to work collaboratively and in partnership to build resilience with us all within our businesses, our communities, our environments, for only then will we realise what sustainability means. But before I leave you, I want to finish up and mention, if I could take a minute to talk about our upcoming conference, the International Conference on Business, Economics, Management and Sustainability, which will be held in early July next year. The conference builds on our research, and we encourage you to consider submitting an abstract. Abstracts are due not too far in the future, on the 5th of January, so be prepared. And this is a great opportunity for us to continue the discourse on cities, communities, sustainabilities and transformative economies. So we look forward to seeing you at this virtual conference next year. A link and flyer will be provided to you all after the webinar. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Joe, and thank you, Diana, and thank you, Taha, as well. I see we've come to the end of our time here tonight. So thank you all three for your wonderful presentation, and also to the audience that have joined us tonight in what is JCU's last webinar for 2020. And so we're really looking forward to re-engaging in 2021 as well. So we'd really appreciate your feedback as audience members, and so that we can continue to develop an interesting and engaging webinars throughout this series in 2021. So if you wouldn't mind sparing some time to complete our feedback survey, that would be great. So a link should appear once we finish the webinar. If you stay on, there should be a link that will appear that will allow you to log on and undertake that survey for us, which would be great. We have the website there, jcu.edu.au/webinars. So this has been recorded and it will be uploaded onto that website. But also, if you want to go back and look at some of the other exciting webinars from across the university, they'll be there. So particularly if you're from South Australia and you're in lockdown, you'll be able to watch all of those webinars over the next 6 days, which will be great fun. So we have a couple of quick questions. Just to say thank you. So thanks to those people that are popping those thanks into the chat. Thanks again to Diana, to Joe, and to Taha. Also thanks to the technical staff and the marketing people and everyone at JCU to make this a success, and also to the internet gods to making sure that we had a stable connection through the whole process. So thank you all once again, and we look forward to connecting with you next year.